Hi everyone, I am so excited to be here, and I've just gotten more and more excited to give this talk as I've been meeting with folks. Everyone is just so interesting and also so nice. It's just been a really great experience here, so thank you for being so welcoming. What's fun about this talk, I've given it several times, and what I like about it is it actually ends up being sort of a bit of a story of my trajectory. I'll talk about work that I did as a postdoc, all the way to work that I literally just wrote up last week. So it's kind of a fun story for me to kind of think about how all of this progressed. If you ever have any questions as a trainee, what trajectories sort of look like, I'm happy to answer those. I'm associate of doctoral education because I just love training folks. I love mentoring. I love giving unsolicited advice. That's the best reason to be a dean. So please feel free to ask any questions. So with that, I'll give a quick start. I neglected to put an agenda slide, so let me just kind of talk through that real quick. Pretty standard stuff. I'll talk a little bit about just sort of the state of smoking and smoking cessation among Latinos, a little bit on the disparities in that area in particular. I want to present to you sort of the primary theoretical model that I used to inform my research, but also what I argued in my K a million years ago, what I thought were sort of the limitations of it, and then I'll go into some studies that kind of are examples of how I attempted to address those aims over the years. Sound good so far? All right, lots of nodding heads. You guys are awesome. You are very interactive. I also am a big walker, a big talker, so I apologize in advance if I get off the camera every now and then. So real quick, I'm sure everyone has seen this and is familiar with this. This is smoking prevalence rates by race ethnicity in the US. And you can see our overall here is 12.5%, right? But if we focus on Hispanic populations, we're seeing that that's quite a bit lower at 8%, and particularly lower compared to our white adult population at 13.3%. This is always really tricky because when I get reviews on anything from a manuscript to a grant, it's always like, this is the question of why should we care? These are folks who actually are showing sort of a protective effect. They're less likely to smoke. And so I think like a really important thing to think about is sort of when you see something like this, and you really often have to proactively sort of defend why this is an important population, why this is an important approach, because a lot of times folks just sort of see this. And so what I will argue though is, so Latinos have, again, a lower smoking prevalence rate, particularly compared to whites, but the disparities really exist among those Latinos who smoke. That's where the important issues are. And in particular, before I jump ahead, not only, sorry. Is that you?
They can't see your slides online.
Oh.
So I'm just going to.
We're not sharing yet? This slows me down. This is good. Take up some time. I can talk really fast, especially when I get excited. So feel free to slow me down. Let me get out of presenter view here. All right, much better. So I didn't do that. There we go. Good. Now we're set. So a little bit more about our smoking topography among Latinos to kind of send the message a little bit more. So again, we have lower smoking prevalence rates compared to whites. Also, what's really interesting about Latino smokers is that they have, like, on average, what I would call a less severe smoking pattern. So on average, Latinos are much more likely to be non-daily smokers, right? Significantly much more likely. And among those who smoke, they actually smoke fewer cigarettes per day. This is separated by daily smokers. Their cigarettes per day among Latinos is about nine compared to 15. And then for non-daily, it's about 3 compared to 5.5. So not only are they less likely to smoke, but among those who smoke, they don't smoke nearly as much. So again, another reason for folks to ask, why should we care, right? So this is why I think we should care. Essentially is that there's this really interesting phenomenon in that despite these less severe smoking patterns, which if you think about it and you have a strong tobacco background, I'm sure you're already saying that this less severe smoking background is actually kind of indicative of less dependence, right? Which we all know should then predict better smoking rates or better quitting rates, excuse me, right? That's just a pretty logical model. What's odd about that is that despite that less severe smoking pattern, Latinos are actually no more likely to quit than white smokers. So they actually have, studies will show that they'll have either similar rates of quitting or they will have worse quitting rates. And that's just when I was a postdoc and I was reading through the literature and I realized this, that was the first thing that I noticed that just really struck me as just a strange phenomenon that I wanted to learn more about. So again, the idea is not so much that the disparities are among prevalence, but it's really among smokers that we're seeing sort of these interesting disparities. So not only that, but we do see a lot of treatment-related disparities. I'm sure you all are familiar with this with really a lot of underserved populations, but they're less likely to be screened for smoking status when they are at a health visit, right? They're less likely to be advised to quit, and they're less likely to use cessation aids, okay? Why this is a whole nother conversation, but you can imagine why something like this would contribute to these sort of strange cessation rates, right? Then I'll also argue that there are some really strong disparities in just the research in terms of particularly their representation in research. So this, what I'm showing you here is what Monica Webb Cooper called a mini-meta-analysis of treatment studies that particularly focused on Latino populations. So these were all RCTs that were looking at, not RCTs necessarily, but treatment studies that were looking at interventions for smoking cessation among Latino populations.
You're stuck on slide 3 for some reason.
Out there?
Yeah, out in the world.
You could have shared just that one slide, like if you're not sharing.
We have to
whole
share the
screen.
presentation window.
Oh, yeah.
You took off the presentation window, it's not there anymore. So
So if I
put it into presentation mode and then you want to share that.
I see what you mean. I think should do it right.
So you're in presentation mode now. Yes.
Okay. So then, oh, yep.
You just got it.
Do this. And then how do I get back to? And I do this.
There we go. So share that one.
This one. All right.
Or can we ask them if that's the right one?
Let me see. That's what it is.
Looks like it's nothing.
I think we're good now.
Oh, we're good?
Okay. Are we good? Now, where is presentation mode for me? Here it is. I want to hide presenter view. Are we still good?
Maybe.
Do they see it moving?
Yeah.
Okay.
That looks good.
We'll get it right, folks. Happens all the time, right? So, where was I? Meta-analysis. I found this one really interesting too. This was in 2010, and I want to say too that Monica Hooper actually then updated this with another publication that really didn't show much of a difference. But the idea here is that essentially there are really very few smoking cessation trials targeting Latinos. That's kind of the bottom line. I believe that in this study they found something like less than a dozen, but even then only these 5 here were actually RCTs. So the gold standard was really only with 5 interventions. And so then she was looking really at the effectiveness of them, and essentially there was very modest efficacy at end of treatment, odds ratio about 1.5, and that was really just end of treatment. There were really no long-term effects at all for these studies. So the idea here is very few studies, those few that are out there, don't seem to be working very well, at least in the long term. Another thing that I want to add is I just kind of want to put into perspective what this number of, about a dozen studies that Monica Webb Hooper found, I believe was between 2000, it was from 2008 and before. And I want to put some perspective on that by telling you just a little bit about the tobacco use and dependence guidelines. For those of you who are not familiar with them, this is essentially the practice manual, the best practice guidelines for tobacco cessation, and it's all based on just many different meta-analyses. This is really just a report of several meta-analyses that then inform the recommendations. So it was first published in about a little bit before 2000, and then they did a 2008 update. And so what they did was they had to look for all of the new RCTs that were published between 2000 and 2008. There were more than 300 RCTs just between 2000 and 2008 that they were able to include in this update. And from 2008 all the way to the beginning of time, there were about 12 studies on Latinos. So I just kind of want to put you into perspective how little that really is. Okay, so it's actually a really big deal. Some folks could say 12 is a lot. 12 is practically nothing. All right, so that to me is really the significance here. Sort of, it's the why should we care? Why do we do what we do, right? I want to switch gears just a little bit and tell you kind of how I tend to, the prominent theory with which I approach my research, and it's really social cognitive theory or relapse prevention theory. What's important about here is we're talking about really a social cognitive model, and it's really talking about one's propensity to either use or to relapse in what they're calling a high-risk situation, right? So it's this outside, these contextual factors that kind of surround all of these other determinants. And what it argues here is that there are certainly these, what they're calling tonic processes, or rather variables that are fairly stable. They're fairly long-term. They don't really change. They don't actually change very much over time. Things like family history, things like education, these sorts of things. And these things affect what they then call these phasic responses, or these more dynamic things that can change in the moment. Emotion, coping, self-regulation, these sorts of more cognitive factors that are much more proximal to one's eventual risk of using a substance or relapsing. Okay? Not only that, this argues that there are a lot of sort of reciprocal relationships among these variables, right? So it's a very complex model that takes into account, again, long-term stable, more proximal and dynamic variables, and also context. Really great model. What I argued, actually in my KA a very long time ago, was that as great as this model is, and actually there's a substantial amount of research that really supports this model, right? This is a very long-standing model of substance use. But what I would argue in my KA was that what we don't really know is how much these factors that are so well researched and are used to inform treatment development, how well they really generalize to understudied populations, in my case, namely Latinos. Okay? We don't actually know how a lot of these generalize, because the vast majority of work that has examined this model has been on either majority white or exclusively white populations of smokers. That's really what the data shows. So that's one thing. The other thing that I argued is that it doesn't really, it doesn't really take into account, at least explicitly, what I call culturally relevant variables. And these are variables that might either be uniquely important to a particular population or even just differentially important. They may be important to multiple populations, but maybe it's more important to some population. That's not really at least explicitly accounted for here. And so a lot of my work from that point on was just to try to answer these two questions, to try to address these two gaps. Let's see. Okay, so from there, I kind of want to give you just a few examples of what I've done over the years in pursuit of these particular aims. So I want to tell you a little bit about some work I did in this area of generalizability of what I call known determinants. So again, these are the determinants that tend to have a lot of data behind them, but just maybe haven't been looked at in specific populations. So I want to tell you about a study I did looking at depressive symptoms, and a couple of studies I did looking at positive and negative affect. And then I want to tell you about this got a little, sorry guys, I think in the translation, this got a little funky on the font. So I'm sorry if this keeps happening. So then I want to tell you about a couple of examples where I looked at what I'm calling culturally relevant factors, namely acculturation and gender, because you'll learn that you really can't look at acculturation without also looking at gender and Latinos. I love all of the nodding heads. You all know this already, right? This is fantastic. And then this is a study that I literally finished last week. I will tell you a little bit about social norms. And there's probably one slide on that because I threw it in at the end, but it'll be fun to talk about. All right, are we ready? Keep going. Okay, I get scared now.
I know, I'm sorry.
I say I'm walking too far away, aren't I?
That's good.
Just do your thing. Don't worry about it.
Yeah, don't worry about
Just
me. Ignore
do
me.
More motivation to come in person.
Ignore me how everyone else does.
All right. I hate staying still and I hate
No,
staying
you're
Do your
fine.
thing.
Just keep going. You're
Seriously.
good.
Yeah.
All right, a little bit of background, things I'm sure that you know. Depression symptoms and diagnoses are associated with a lot of variables related to commercial tobacco use, right? Just the prevalence, lifetime smoking or quitting. When you're engaged in a particular quit attempt, your success in that attempt is also affected by depressive symptoms. And depressive symptoms are strongly associated with nicotine dependence. So a lot of reason to believe that this is a very important determinant of smoking. I really asked a more exploratory question of how does this find generalized Latino populations? This was probably one of the very first studies that I engaged in, where I didn't really have really strong specific questions. I really just kind of wanted to know. And I was lucky enough to have a lot of data to be able to just test questions. Funny story, well, I'll save that story. Okay, so real quick, this is not my study. This is a study by Carla Berg. I believe is she still at Emory or not anymore?
No, I think
Somewhere else.
in DC.
Where?
In DC at
DC?
the George Washington.
Oh, okay. So Carla Berg is a great person, great tobacco researcher. Real stellar, real machine in terms of publication. She's amazing. And I ran across this study of hers where she looked at a population sample in Minnesota. This was the needs assessment survey. And she was really just looking at sort of cross-sectional relationships between a measure of depression and smoking prevalence, okay? And she looked at differences by race ethnicity, okay? And here's what she found. So this is a little bit hard to see, so I'm gonna help you out a little bit. Here, you're seeing the association for her white sample. So you're seeing that with folks who have a history of depression have higher smoking prevalence rates than those who don't. Pretty clear, right? And then here it is for Latinos. That relationship is not significant at all. Incidentally, the relationship for Asian folks is also not significant. It was significant for African American, American Indian, and white populations. No one had, here's, what I always find fascinating is this is just an interaction. This is a super simple analysis that nobody really bothered to just check out. You know, these important questions can be answered with such simple data, such simple analyses, and we still aren't seeing this happening nearly as much. Right? So this is what she found with prevalence. I want to tell you what I found with cessation. So this was, again, a study that I didn't post off. This was my mentor's data. It was a longitudinal cohort study of a little over 400 people, about equal size subsamples of Black, white, and Latino persons, and they were engaged in a quit attempt. So we were helping these folks try to quit, and then following them for about 6 months. So I wanted to basically ask the same question. I looked at the moderating effect of race ethnicity at pre-quit on moderating effect of race on the relationship between depression and smoking abstinence, not prevalence, but abstinence, right? And here's what I found. So here is on your horizontal axis, you're seeing a person's Cessation score. On the vertical axis, you're seeing the proportion of persons who remain abstinent. You're seeing week 1, week 2, and week 4 follow-ups, okay? So here you're seeing our white sample, and you're seeing pretty much this negative relationship, right? The greater depression, the less likely they are to stay abstinent. Here's what we found for Latinos. This was actually not significant. These are essentially straight lines. There was no relationship between depression and quitting in this sample. Real simple question that shows you something really important, right? Okay, so here's my funny story. I'm going to be so over time.
Go for it.
I actually found this, again, this was exploratory, and so I found this, this effect, and I told Steve about it. I hope he's here. I hope he's not here. That I'm not at all trying to talk negatively, but I just think it's a funny story. And he said, no, that can't be right. That's got to be a fluke. No, I don't believe it. And so we sort of put this on the back burner for a while because he's like, no, it's got to be a fluke. Then Carla Berg's paper came out. And then he's like, well, maybe it's not a fluke. So it's kind of funny. All right, so that is one example of how a really well-known determinant of smoking may not actually generalize to understudied populations, to Latino populations. So let me tell you a little bit about a couple of studies that we did with positive and negative affect. It seems like I don't need to really explain this to folks in terms of what positive and negative affect is, right? So just kind of general tendency to experience both positive and negative emotions. So we know that this is much broader than depression per se, right? And so we see, so it's actually kind of a little bit different in terms of how it influences smoking. I looked at these variables in a sample that we're calling Alcanzando Nuestra Salud. This is just, this was actually a data set that I collected for a psychometric study. So these are almost 300 Mexican-American smokers who, with a Spanish-speaking preference. And we were just exploring associations of these social cognitive variables, again, consistent with relapse prevention or social cognitive model. We looked at loneliness, social support, positive affect, and negative affect. And this is actually a student of mine who's on the job market right now, so it's very exciting, Tatiana. And we want to see how these variables were associated with what we were calling these intermediate predictors of smoking, right? So motivation, product contemplation ladder, and self-efficacy. So we started off with, again, a typical analytic approach. We wanted to see how those were associated, on their own, right, with separate regression analyses controlling for various demographics. And then we took those that were significant and we put them into one model to sort of see which one would come out. So really kind of a classic fighting against each other kind of approach, which is fun. So here's what she found for the model predicting contemplation ladder. Essentially, in those individual analyses, it was loneliness and negative affect that predicted contemplation. And when you put those into a model together, only negative affect was a significant predictor. So right now we're sort of seeing that seems to maybe generalize, right? It ends up getting a little bit more complicated. So when we're looking at that model predicting self-efficacy, we saw that both negative and positive affect predicted self-efficacy in their individual models. And then when you put them in a model together, they were both significant. So cool. One thing I do kind of want to mention though is there is a pretty strong amount of research that's examining negative affect. This is not necessarily a new finding. What is a relatively novel finding, and I know when you're working on hedonia that this is very, very similar, that we don't really see a lot about positive affect. We just don't. Folks really focus on negative affect and negative emotions. I think likely just because there's a lot of withdrawal and dependence related sorts of issues there. But we don't see a lot on this positive affect variable that is, with the very limited research that's out there, shown to be really promising. In fact, this sort of cross-sectional analysis looking at these intermediate outcomes jived fairly nicely with a different study that I did on my own. This was more of a bit of a prospective study. It's that same sample I told you about with the 3 different subsamples. What I did was I looked at all of these variables, again, kind of thinking about that reciprocal relationship that social cognitive model argues. And what I really wanted to see was what were, if any, reciprocal relationships among these variables. So a pretty fun, this was also something I did in, I think, postdoc, and so it was a fun lesson in path analysis. Very fun. So we looked at pre-quit measures of motivation, self-efficacy, positive and negative affect, and craving, all really strong known predictors, except of course for positive affect. And then we looked at them again on the quit day. So we were looking to see whether or not there were really reciprocal relationships between the pre-quit and post-quit, quit day on these determinants. And then ultimately we wanted to look at how that whole model predicted abstinence. Do sort of a little bit of exploratory model trimming, and here's what we ended up with. We actually saw reciprocal relationships among motivation and self-efficacy, which is kind of fun. We saw reciprocal relationships between self-efficacy and positive affect. So positive affect is showing up here again. And in addition to that, we saw that there was an indirect effect of pre-quit motivation on abstinence through self-efficacy. And we also found that indirect effect of pre-quit positive affect through self-efficacy on abstinence. So again, we're getting some really cool stuff on this understudied variable. And what's also important here is I actually looked at this model for equivalence across race ethnicity. So this model worked for white, Black, and Latino smokers. Okay. What I think is interesting here is when you look at this larger model, you're noticing that negative affect in particular kind of fell out when we looked at it with all these other predictors. It became relatively less important. Okay. Same thing with craving. Right? And so I love that this actually ends up looking like a bit of a resilience model that we don't pay enough attention to. All right, so some sort of some pausing in the middle here as we change gears. It was important to really notice that depression, which is a really important determinant, might not be a critical determinant to smoking among Latinos. One, it's important to understand that that really contradicts what we've thought based on general population studies. And really the implication here is important. It tells us, we tend to really, again, focus on negative affect, even depression in our intervention studies, but that might not be very useful for interventions among Latinos. That's a huge implication, okay? Really neat to see that we're seeing maybe much more focus needs to be made on positive affect. Really these more resilience variables, positive affect, self-efficacy, motivation, at least in this one study, really came out as more important than those sort of negative variables. And really positive affect seems to be really promising, but understudied. And I can't underscore that in this particular example, we actually found that this wasn't just something that was unique to a particular population, right? This was actually true for all three groups. It's an important finding to have. Okay, I'm going to change gears now. Is that okay? So I'll show you some examples about or what I'm calling the culturally relevant variables that are important to smoking. A little bit of background here. Gender and smoking, definitely there's a complicated relationship there, because when you look at the prevalence rates by sex in sort of the overall population, we're seeing a small trend for men to have higher smoking prevalence rates compared to women. So for men, that smoking prevalence rate is 13.1. For women, it's 11. That's I think that's a notable. I don't even know if that's a notable gender difference. It's a bit of a gender difference, honestly. But the important thing here is that when we're looking at these things, when we're combining our groups like this, we're actually obscuring really important differences among particular groups. Like for example, Latinos. So when you separate out groups and you look at sort of Hispanic populations compared to white populations, you're seeing this very dramatic gender difference in smoking, right? So among Hispanics, men have a prevalence rate of 11.6 compared to women, which is just under 5. And among our white folks, it's 13.6 versus 13. That's hardly a difference there. So just a really important reminder that you never want to just blindly aggregate populations without really knowing whether it's appropriate to do so. Good reminder. So anyway, let's talk a little bit more about Latinos, gender and smoking among Latinos. Let me bring in acculturation real quick and just let's remind ourselves a little bit about what it is. This is actually a model. Jennifer Unger is an author on this paper who I spoke with earlier. Lovely lady, y'all are very lucky to have her. But this is kind of generally how we're seeing acculturation in terms of its contemporary theory. And the bottom line here is that it's very, very complicated, right? We understand that it's sort of what we call bidirectional, right? There are acculturation factors related to the receiving culture, or I would call like the mainstream culture, and one's heritage culture or culture of origin. So we're acculturating in two directions, and we're acculturating across various different factors. It's practices or behaviors, it's often our values and our beliefs, which I think are very important, and even our identifications. So there are, it's multifaceted, it's multidimensional, multidirectional, this idea of acculturation. Problem is we don't treat it that way, right? Let's just get that out of the way, we all know this. The vast majority of the time we're looking at our proxies, and these are some of them, language and activity, so on, which really kind of tell us about length of time in the US, but are really problematic in ways that I'm sure you're all aware of. We'll leave that at that. This is an older systematic review looking at the relationship between acculturation and smoking by gender. And it's really a small subset of examples. I want to underscore that this is an extremely, extremely robust finding in the literature. And so here's what you're finding. Essentially, we're seeing that we have a differential association of acculturation with smoking. You look at this sample, or you look at this column, so this is the findings among men in these various studies. Essentially, there's nothing there. Essentially, there is no association between acculturation and smoking prevalence among men. Among women, it's overwhelmingly a positive association. So greater acculturation or English proficiency or time in the US or whatnot is associated with greater smoking prevalence rates among women. Okay? And again, this is a very robust finding in the literature. Real quick, here is gender and smoking cessation. This is just a quick picture from, I don't think it was a meta-analysis, I think it was a review of differences in quitting among men and women. So on the left square here, you're seeing a collection of efficacy trials. If you see that big long black line where that represents no effect among the studies. Anything to the left of that were studies where women were less likely to quit than men. Anything to the right of that zero, women were more likely to quit, okay? And then same thing over here, just with effectiveness trials. Here, women were less likely to quit on the left, women were more likely to quit on the right. Obviously, overwhelmingly, women are less likely to quit in a given quit attempt. Now, I know that's still considered an inconsistent finding, but it's a pretty strong finding. So I just want to note that, that's our background. Okay? Now let's kind of put it all together. I wanted to know, this was literally, I think, the first study I ever did in tobacco. I saw that finding with prevalence, and I really just want to know, well, what about cessation? That was my simple question. Does that generalize to cessation? And so that's what I looked at. And first I wanted to go through and see what had been out there in terms of looking at this relationship between acculturation and cessation. And at the time, I found very little out there. Okay? At the time, there were 3 published studies that looked at this. And I'll show you the 4th one that was published after mine. Essentially, I saw inconsistent findings across studies. Now, if for grad students and for undergrads, if you've read your Barron and Kenny, this is a very important paper. Understanding that what Barron and Kenny talk about in terms of mediation is obsolete. What they talk about in terms of moderation still pretty much holds. And what they find is if you ever are seeing different findings across different studies, that right there is an immediate clue that there's probably an unidentified moderator. Okay? And that's exactly what I saw. 3 studies. One study found no association between acculturation and cessation. One found a positive relationship. One found a negative relationship. And the one that was published after my paper found no association. This is what you call inconsistent findings. What the heck is going on here? So it's always fun to then think about what is an important unidentified moderator that could possibly clarify these findings. So much fun, okay? Learning things. So given everything that I just talked about, the obvious moderator was gender, right? So I looked at the relationship between acculturation and cessation with gender as the moderating factor. This was with a small clinical trial that we called IAS. These were 280 Spanish-speaking folks in Houston engaged in a quit attempt. And because the study was collected the data before I got there, we just had the proxies. I would have put in something a little bit stronger. But so I looked at it with preferred media language, US residency, and proportion of life in the US. This was just relatively exploratory. I predicted an interaction effect, but I had no idea what that interaction effect might look like. Okay? I looked at accident status at 11 weeks post-quit, strange time point. That's what it was. So here's what I found. Across all the next figures that I'm going to show you, you're going to see the acculturation proxy on the horizontal axis. Here's US residency. You're going to see the probability of accidents on the vertical. The blue represents men. The red, orangish, represents women. Okay? So what we're seeing here is that among men, more years of US residency was associated with greater probability of abstinence. Among women, there was no association. Here it is with proportion of life in the US. Same thing. Among men, positive association. Among women, no association. And then finally, here's preferred media language. Same thing. That was very exciting. Why? Who knows? One thing, again, for the students, so I love giving unsolicited advice. You really don't want to just engage in sort of blind, willy-nilly interaction effects. You really want to have some theory behind it, some a priori hypothesis behind it, because usually when you are a little bit more willy-nilly about it, they're almost impossible to replicate. Almost impossible to replicate. So the more theory, the more prediction you have behind it, the stronger the more confident you can be when you find an interaction effect. And the other thing that's important, of course, replication, right? So that's one, when I had that first finding, I really got excited about trying to see if I can do it again, and also with a better measure. So that's what I did with this particular sample. Por Nuestra Salud, these were almost 200 Mexican smokers, Spanish speakers, also engaged in quit attempt. We're following them over time. So in this case, I looked at a multidimensional acculturation scale. This is Rodriguez, if anybody's interested in it. It had 4 subscales, where it looked at English proficiency and Spanish proficiency, pretty standard measures, but also there were measures of cultural identity there. Okay? So very different from our proxies. I was almost actually a little bit concerned that it wouldn't replicate because it was so different. So here's another thing about moderation though, right? Now I have this one study that gives me very specific directional associations. So now I have these directional predictions. I really got to put my money where my mouth is. And I really have to predict that there will be an association there among men, but not among women. So here's what we found. So we looked at abstinence among 3 and 6 months post-quit. Again, you're seeing our acculturation indicator on the horizontal, the probability of abstinence on the vertical. Our dotted line is women, our non-dotted line is men. And we found the same thing. And I freaked out. So here it is with Spanish proficiency. And here's what's important, sort of these measures are actually probably the closest to the proxies that I was using. I think that's important to know, because we didn't find it with the identification variables. Okay, so some implications here, just mid-pause, right? We now know that acculturation is important to smoking among both men and women, but in very different ways. Okay, it's for smoking among women, for cessation among men, and I think at the very least this has some interesting implications for targeting particular groups in terms of intervention or prevention. Right? I think that's fun. I think there's no doubt that we really need to have much more explicit attention to culturally relevant variables that can have real practical implications like this. And I think this is a really great example of that. And over the years, I've gotten, honestly, a little bit annoyed at acculturation, because what we still don't understand is, really, what is it that's happening during acculturation that is accounting for this effect? So much like we wouldn't say that because someone is Hispanic, they're more likely to do this or that, right? It's not about being Hispanic, it's about what that signifies, or what is it that that's tapping into is really as a proxy, right? And there really kind of are more social, interpersonal, and societal kind of factors that that are influenced by someone's reaction to me as Hispanic. And that's so much more complicated than because I'm Hispanic, this is happening. The same thing with acculturation. It's not the fact that one only speaks Spanish or one only speaks English that accounts for this relationship. It's what that means. And certainly our proxies don't hit at that. And even these measures of acculturation don't hit at that. They're really measuring sort of this broad idea, and almost a little bit of everything in terms of those, in terms of these kind of more specific factors. Even an acculturation measure just measures these more broadly. So we can't even really say, well, what is it about acculturation that's accounting for this? So I'm really in a place where I'm much less in love with acculturation broadly, and I want to know more what is that's happening in the process of acculturation. So it's really about changes in these much more specific factors that I think we should be paying more attention to, because those are the things that I think we can really intervene on. Did I talk about this? Okay. One area that's had a lot of speculation, but no data behind it, in terms of explaining both of these associations, and I'm at fault for putting it out there as well, is this idea of social norms. There is one paper in particular, I think it was Bethel and Schenker, I think that was the review, that speculated that it's possible that women, we may be seeing these increased prevalence rates among women with acculturation, because perhaps women with greater acculturation are adopting these more accepting norms about smoking among women that may exist in the US compared to their heritage culture. That's possibly what's happening. And that men, we may not be seeing any association among men with prevalence because it may be similarly acceptable in the two cultures. That's actually it's very logical, it's a really strong explanation, but it's complete speculation, okay? And I sort of naively said, well, I'm just gonna say the same thing about cessation. That makes sense, let me say that. So it's, I kind of I cited Bethel and Schenker, and I said, well, maybe there's some similar sort of process going on here, that maybe we're seeing changes in the acceptability or in the encouragement of cessation among men, but not among women, and maybe that's explaining it. Again, complete speculation. What I'm going to show you next is a very simple study, but I still get an example of how important it is to really dig down deeper into what acculturation is. I really just wanted to know, is the basis of this even true? So I wasn't even asking, are changes in social norms adoption associated with smoking? I wanted to know, are there differences in social norms, in one's perceived norms? So that's what I looked at. I didn't get a chance to really highlight these with my my graphics, so I'll walk you through it. Let's first look at the first two rows here. You're looking at a sample of 174 male smokers, and we asked them really just about descriptive norms. This was a question about how common, out of every 10 smokers, how many do you think smoke? Excuse me, I'm gonna do that again. Out of every 10 Latino men in the US, how many do you think smoke? And the same thing, out of every 10 men in Mexico, how many do you think smoke? So that was our descriptive social norm, okay? And then we did the same thing with the US. The injunctive question was something like, how acceptable do you think it is for women to smoke in the US, for women to smoke in Mexico, okay? So very simple questions, and I examined these, the perceptions separately for men and women. I actually combined the sample and I found the same thing. So what you're looking here, results for men, we're seeing these descriptive norms. How common do you think it is? We're seeing about, they were saying it looks about 60%. Remember, they're all smokers. So chances are they're hanging out with a lot of smokers. That part makes sense. But what's important is that when you ask them about how common it is in the US versus Mexico, there's no difference in these two numbers, the 6.1 and the 6.9. There's no difference there. When you ask them about injunctive norms for men, you're seeing no real difference there. Is this difference? I think this might have been labeled backwards. I'm trying to think. Okay, let me keep going. As opposed to when you ask women, you're seeing these large differences. Yeah, this is backwards. Oh my goodness. Forgive me, folks. This is the male column is mislabeled. This is the male column is actually men, and women is actually the men is actually women, and women is actually men. That was just a typo because I know these results. They were just switched, so forgive me. And I will try not to be too confusing. So this first column is among women. Among women, we saw no differences in these two variables. And among men, we saw these large differences where it seemed that descriptive norms were particularly, wait a second, I'm losing my, oh, I see what I did. I'm sorry, let me fix myself. I was looking at the effect size instead of the p-value. That's where I got confused. I apologize. Let's get rid of all of that again. Effect size, p-value, I'm back. This is correct. This is what happens when you don't practice this slide. I literally threw this on right before I sent it in the email. One more time. Among men, here we go. Our differences were significantly different, and we're seeing an effect size about 0.43. Now that made sense. See, forgive me. Injunctive norms were also significantly different. We were seeing effect size about 0.3. We were seeing no differences among women. Thank you, I said that correctly finally. Forgive me for confusing you. So in other words, there's sort of definitely mixed findings here. This speculation about women, that perhaps there were different norms between the US and Mexico that accounted for this prevalence rate. This sort of says that it's, that sort of would say that's kind of unlikely because we're not seeing even differences across the two cultures in terms of their perceptions, but we are seeing them among men, right? There is this difference in social norms in the US among men versus the social norms in Mexico. So this is saying that among men, this social norm hypothesis is actually possibly feasible. Okay? It doesn't answer the question, right, of whether or not that really accounts for it. Is that association account for by social norms? But it's giving us some data to indicate that that's a good place to go to look, at least among men, but maybe not among women. To me, that's like much, much more informative than acculturation. That's kind of the bottom line. I do know my own work, I promise. I'm a little bit embarrassed about that. This was not paying attention to my columns. So, bottom line, big picture take home points. We cannot really assume that, the generalizability of our findings. This is really, really an empirical question. And it's really unfortunate that we still have to remind folks about that. It's really not that hard to test these sorts of hypotheses. And they're just really, really important questions to ask. So we don't always just assume generalizability. We want to test that. This, I think, I've really learned that's how important it is to have proper representation of subgroups in your samples. It's really not enough to just have representative samples, especially if particular representation doesn't necessarily lead to a diverse sample, right? We really want to make the effort to have sufficient numbers of individuals to be able to look at meaningful subgroup differences and avoid what is happening.
Sorry, we get, there's spam, like, it's ridiculous.
And really, really give us a better understanding of kind of those nuanced differences of determinants when we really take time to look at groups in and of themselves. It's important to compare different groups to really understand possibly what's going on, but I personally think that it's also really, really important to examine groups in their own right, okay? And that's because, again, there are potentially uniquely important variables, or even just differentially important variables. When I submitted an R21, the major critique here was, I was looking at a measure among Latinos, and I think a couple folks said, well, why aren't you comparing that measure to a white sample? because that's not my question. And I stood by that, and I think folks respected that. Right, so sometimes it just doesn't make sense to compare groups. It really makes more sense to look at someone in their own right. Sometimes these things are unique. What happened there? There we go. I also would argue, we really need to start paying more attention to what is it that's changing in acculturation, not just acculturation. Because all of these things, these aren't just sort of exercises in thought. All of these things have real world practical implications on quality of care, efficacy of interventions, really important stuff. All right, I'm done. How did I do?